Welcome to Living Room Talk, a short Friday night video blog on current events. This week's topic, Poor Loser, how Trump's attempts to subvert the electoral process can cost us big time and for a long time. My name is John Graham. If you're new here, my quick intro is I'm a lifelong adventurer, a former Foreign Service officer, a writer, a speaker, a political and social activist, and for over 3 decades, a leader of the Giraffe Heroes Project, a global movement inspiring people to stick their necks out for the common good. More at johngraham.org. There's a memoir, Sit Down Young Stranger, on Amazon. Donald Trump, as of 10 minutes ago, is still delaying and disrupting certification of an election he lost by more than 6 million votes. He's ordered his administration not to cooperate with the president-elect's team, so they can't provide the resources normally given an incoming president, from office space to intelligence briefings. This makes the transition all that more difficult, endangers national security, and cripples planning for pandemic solutions. But it's not the first time a poor loser has endangered American national interest. I witnessed one of those times. In the summer of 1968, the State Department transferred me, a young Foreign Service officer, to the American Embassy in Libya, a country on the north coast of Africa, which was then a feudal kingdom. Run by a corporate elite, it was awash in new oil wealth, very little of which trickled down to ordinary people, blocking their rising expectations of a better life. So the country was a political time bomb, whose fuse had already been lit in the vast and empty desert just south of the Mediterranean beaches. A group of young army officers had begun plotting the coup that would change their country and the Middle East forever. America was blind to the threat. Our prediction was that the old king eventually would be eased out by a junta of U.S. and British trained army officers. The country would keep its pro-American tilt, and the kickback money from oil would simply flow into a new set of Libyan pockets. But during the night of September 1st, 1969, those young officers in the desert, led by a lieutenant named Muammar Gaddafi, took control of Libya, and the coup was so cleverly planned and executed, so welcomed by the people of Libya, that by morning, Gaddafi controlled the country, and the old king was sent into exile in Egypt. But who was Gaddafi? The U.S. had never heard of him. The ambassador gave me 48 hours to find out, and I called on every source I had to write the first profile of the new Libyan leader. We finally cabled Washington that Gaddafi was not a communist dupe. He seemed to have as little love for the Soviets as he had for us. Gaddafi was a hyper-religious man, we told Washington, a Muslim zealot. In those pre-ISIS days, that information was treated as good news. My official job at the embassy was liaison officer between the embassy and Wheelus Air Base, a huge U.S. Air Force and NATO training base 7 miles east of the city. So I had a front row seat on everything that was about to happen there. The first thing Gaddafi did was to demand that the United States turn over the Wheelus base to his new government. Since the base had been put there under the friendly king, its only defense was a chain-link fence that kept camels off the runway. We could have flown in troops to protect the base, but that would have started a war, cut off a supply of Libyan oil to the world. Grudgingly, the U.S. agreed to the Libyan demand and began negotiating the terms of the transfer of the runways, the barracks, the hangars, the hospital. The talks promised to be tough but doable. The young Libyan revolutionaries resented America's support for Israel and for a corrupt feudal regime in their country that cared very little for the needs of ordinary people. The Americans were outraged that a bunch of 20-something hotheads were stealing our airbase and blaming us for every real or imagined wrong in their world. Still, while it was clear that Gaddafi would never be an ally, it was also obvious that if the talks over transition at Wheelis bogged down or blew up, it could fatally damage the chance to salvage even a minimal set of trade-offs between the United States and the new Libya. The stakes were high. For the U.S., there was, beside the base, keeping the lucrative contracts of American companies pumping oil out of the desert, and securing at least Libyan neutrality in the Cold War. On the Libyan side, the U.S. was supplying parts and training for the Libyan Air Force, as well as irrigation technology that was already beginning to help make their desert bloom. We actually thought that the talks over transition to new ownership might move quickly. The Libyans wanted to raise their flag over this prized turf as soon as possible as a symbol of their triumph and giving them bragging rights in the Middle East. And we thought we could strike deals because the Libyan negotiators were mostly young Air Force officers who we'd been training and working with for years. Fat chance. From the first session on, the American Air Force negotiators made a difficult situation worse. They praised one another for pettiness that should have been greeted with embarrassed silence. I remember one afternoon when they refused to leave behind the bedpans from the base hospital. And whenever Americans were forced to leave some equipment behind, they did their best to break it first, right down to the light sockets, and the Libyans weren't pleased. Negotiations that should have taken 2 months took 9. Finally, on a hot, cloudless day in July 1970, the Stars and Stripes was run down the pole at the main gate for the last time, and I watched the last plane load of U.S. Air Force personnel disappear into the summer sky. My job at that moment was to call the embassy and tell them the exact time when our Wheelis became their Iqba bin Nafi Air Base, renamed after one of the Prophet's most bloodthirsty lieutenants. Near the flight line, I reached for a telephone that I'd been using for almost 2 years, and this time I felt a gun in my back and heard an angry voice shouting, "No, America, phone." I turned around slowly with my hands in the air, and I saw a Libyan soldier, his face twisted with anger, his carbine pointed at my chest. "Libya, phone," he snarled. I wasn't about to argue. I backed away, got in my car, and drove off that base for the last time. In retrospect, the rancor unleashed over the Wheelis transition was an important reason why relations between the United States and Gaddafi's Libya started off as badly as they did and continued to worsen. I'm convinced that a responsible effort to build a bridge to the young revolutionaries when we'd had the chance at Wheelis before Gaddafi's course was set might have at least tempered the events that followed. Instead, the consequences of our poor losing were immediate, serious, and ongoing. After the bitter fighting over Wheelis, the U.S. shut off the flow of spare parts to the Libyan Air Force. So the Libyans scrapped our planes and carried on with Russian MiGs and advisors. Gaddafi became our enemy and a major sponsor of global terrorism. In 1986, the U.S. launched a bombing raid against Tripoli, killing one of Gaddafi's children. Gaddafi retaliated by blowing up Pan Am 103 over Scotland. When the U.S. had a chance to help get rid of Gaddafi in 2011, we were happy to do so. But in decapitating a country ruled by one strongman, we created a lawless, failed state. So that made it easy for a mob to attack the American consulate in Benghazi in 2012, killing the American ambassador and feeding a political war in the United States against Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State. Follow this depressing story, and you see the link, I hope, between bedpans and broken light sockets at Wheelus Air Base and lock her up chants 46 years later. The moral of the story is that there's a price to be paid for being a poor loser. And the bigger the stakes, the bigger the price, and the more people that have to pay it. The hell of it is you can't begin to see the price in advance. Donald Trump may be the most dangerous poor loser ever. What he's doing now in this 2020 transition is a deliberate attempt to ratchet up anger, fear, and hate, and it will not go away for a long time. The Democrats aren't saints. They will find a way to hit back, and then on it will go. Every bit of it, another nail in the coffin of a once proud and functioning democracy, a place where reasonable people could agree to disagree, held together by the cultural and constitutional glue that's kept the country working for a more perfect union for 230 years. Knitting this nation back together gets harder every day of this botched transition. That is, of course, the aim of the in-principle fascist still in the White House. What about the Republican leadership, especially in the Senate? Why aren't any of them, or more of them, brave and ethical enough to stand with the Constitution and tell Trump that the American people have spoken and the message is, you're fired? I invite your comments, disagreements, challenges. Thanks for watching. Come back next Friday at 5 p.m. Pacific. Meanwhile, please comment on what you've heard. Like the page, share it with your friends. A print version of this talk will be up on johngraham.org in a few hours. And while you're on my website, do sign up for my print blog, On the Edge. That's all for now from the living room.